that was excellent. Thank you, Jamie. One of the hallmarks of the annual demographic workshop is the variety of the structure. We're going to have two standalone presentations at the beginning, then we'll have two panels with presentations and interaction, and then in the afternoon, we'll have a keynote luncheon speaker, and then in the afternoon, we have our breakout roundtable workshops. So, I mean, there's no other conference that I've ever been to that has such a variety of formats. I am pleased to fill a role in the first pairing of standalone speakers addressing the topic of the millennials themselves. You all know a lot about millennials already, I know, but I've been working on some new things, and it's so new that we didn't even know about it last June when we had our last conference. It hadn't even started. It developed in the fall, and then a press got a hold of it. They already have it online now. It won't be published until January. The address is given at the back of your handout, so I lost my... I'm not good at keeping time, am I? All right, start. All right, so peak millennials. It happened last year, I declare, and I'll show you why. And in developing that answer, we also developed some new theory about how does it all work, and then what does it mean. There's some interesting dynamics here, and it definitely all feeds into the rental crisis that we're facing in Los Angeles and across the nation today. So first, the questions to be addressed here is just basically it's one of are millennials all congregating in the city because they have a new urban preference? That's a story often told. Millennials are different. They like to live in cities. They're going to live there forever, and hallelujah. That's sort of the storyline. Or is it just a temporary episode of presence? Are we confusing presence with preference? And I'll come back to that. And then if it's going to end, why would it end? Why should it end, or why would it end? How do we know that? And what does it all mean for the rental crisis? And why is there a rental crisis, and how do we prepare for the future? These are like really nagging questions we all ask. And the preference versus presence debate has been little displayed in the media or anywhere else. And I'll just touch on it briefly because there's no contest here, gang. I'll give you the presence facts. But first, the preferences. The first and basic facts about millennials. So what is the millennial generation? It's not even well defined. There is no agreement. There is absolutely no agreement, and we've done literature reviews, and it's all over the map. Some people say it starts in 1982, people born in 82 who turned 18 on the millennium, and so that's one way they defined it. It's not like the baby boom where you have a clear start after World War II, or rapid rise in number of babies born, and then a rapid drop in 1964. It's just not clear at all. So we're going to use this definition. It's broader and coming into broader use because it's just it's easier to handle. Basically, born between 1980 and 1999, about 20 years wide, about the same as the baby boomers themselves. In fact, they're larger than the baby boomers. A lot of them are the children of the baby boomers themselves. That's probably why we have a larger number of kids born, because you had a larger number of parents to give birth. And it's really a generation, not an age group. But pretty much all analysts treat it as an age group. It's basically ages 20 to 34. A couple of years from now, they're going to be pushing that upper limit and say, well, the millennials are really age 36 or 37. But for the time being, it's really 20 to 34. And millennials are found everywhere. I mean, there's a lot of them. So they literally are everywhere, and not just downtown, but downtown gets the greatest attention. So quickly now, on urban preferences. Is there any evidence that says that millennials have different preferences? I've gone through a number of Pew surveys and realtor surveys, and in my paper, I review a lot of that literature. And there's differences, yes, but the question is that just because they're young people, and when they grow up, just like their parents did, that they'll be different, become more middle-aged, or will they stay like young millennials their whole lives? Well, obviously they're going to grow up, but how much their preferences will stick is unclear. So here's two examples, I think, that are among the strongest evidence for preferences. The first one is ask a great question. This is from the realtors. For me, the car is king. Nothing will replace my car as my main mode of transportation. This is the percent who disagree with that. And you see that for those who are under age 40, 26% disagree that the car is king. But for people over 50, 18% disagree. There's not a real big difference there. The young people seem to think car is king also. And then the next one below that is when deciding where to live, what's important to me is living in a place at the center of it all. Now that's a really good question. That should get at people who want to live downtown or live really, really central location. And there we see under age 40, a much higher percent who say they want to live near the center of it all. 23%, it's almost a quarter. That means that 3/4 of millennials do not want to live near the center of it all. So there's a difference, but it's not all the millennials. And then I throw in one more thing here. This is kind of interesting. There's a big political factor here. Did you all know about this one? It shows up in many different ways. This is asking people, what's your preferred community to live in? What type of, you want to live in a city, a suburb, or you want to live in a rural area? And among liberals, people who say they're liberals, 46% prefer the city. Among conservatives, 4% prefer the city. They'd rather be in the suburbs or even better in a rural area. So there's a real political schism, and it shows up in electoral politics. That the cities, they vote blue, and the rural areas vote red. What's really more interesting to me is city versus suburb. And you see it is shifted there, out of the city and into the suburbs for the conservatives. So there are these differences. The preferences are definitely there, but are they overrated? And I maintain that most of what we think is a preference is just presence. We see a lot of young people in the city, therefore they love the city. They must love it. Well, maybe everybody who was young used to live in the city. So that's the question. So I have some hard facts. I'm going to give you the demographics. This is a demographic interpretation, which I'm taking to the mainstream. It's got a lot of attention in different places already. So on urban presence. Here we go, on urban presence. What's the facts on that? Here's a graph that Yo-Jung Lee and I produced for the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy, and this shows the percentage of people, the growth, it's a growth rate in different distances from the center of the city. On the left is all the way downtown by City Hall. This is for the nation as a whole, for the top 50 metros. And on the far outside there is people living 80 miles away from the downtown of the big city. And so you see that during the 1990s, the number of people ages 20 to 34 was shrinking. And it was shrinking across the board. It was shrinking out in the exurbs, it was shrinking in the suburbs. And the one place that wasn't shrinking was right far left there, downtown. It was shrinking less than other places. That's the 90s. Of course, we want to compare it to the 2000s. And in the 2000s, boom, a rising tide lifts all boats. There is millennials flooding everywhere. And so it's rising in the exurbs, it's rising in the suburbs, it's rising everywhere except 4 miles away from downtown. There's a dead zone. If you're a millennial, you live downtown, and you don't live 4 miles away from City Hall. Seems to be this deep notch there, but other than that, the millennials are rising everywhere else. Why are millennials rising in the suburbs? Well, one good reason is they're living in their parents' back bedroom. Their parents are in the suburbs. These are just kids. They grew up. Now we call them millennials, and now they're over age 20 and they're still living in their parents. That's one reason. Another reason is they have apartments out in the suburbs because that's where they grew up and their friends are out there and their connections, and there's enough millennials to fill the whole continent, is what it looks like. All right, so is there any evidence here of any special preference for downtown? A little bit. There's a little bit. There's definitely, but it's not overwhelming. So now let me give you the theory. This is a demographic theory. It's well known. I did not invent this theory. This theory right here is the bathtub. The bathtub model is based on migration theory. It says that the population level is determined by your rate of inflow, that's like in-migration into the area, but also it depends on your rate of outflow. And the important thing here is that people always have their eyes on the inflow and they forget the outflow. Why don't they have their eyes on the outflow? It's very practical. Once people leave, they're gone. You can't interview them anymore. Jamie Christie's Census Bureau counters cannot find them when they're gone. They can only find people who've arrived and ask, how long have you lived in this house? And where were you born? And what metro were you living in, a year ago? So we have the inflow information, but not the outflow. And this is critical for understanding the millennials. The millennials have very rapid inflow, and they may have not had a rapid outflow. So they're piling up in the city because they're not leaving the city. They're just coming in, not going out. And I'll explain why in a second. So I have like words on these slides here that I'm not going to talk about, but you have them in your handout. But there's basically a life course perspective here on people flowing into adulthood. It's a life course flow. They're crossing age 18 or they're graduating from college and they're landing in some destination. My son just graduated yesterday at Stanford, and he's going to land in San Francisco, and he's out there looking for an apartment right now. Wish him luck. They're figuring it's going to cost them about $2,500 a piece for 4 roommates. It's going to get to be that bad, they're afraid. It's really bad. And so there's people like him, and they keep wanting to go to the city, and they flow into the city. So the key theory is this, my theory, on top of the bathtub, is that you should view society as an age-graded set of opportunities and slots that people fill. And what my son is looking for is an entry-level job and an entry-level apartment. And there's been a whole generation of people before him going after the same job and the same apartment. And in principle, they turn the apartment over, and they turn the jobs over, and they move up the ladder. And then they vacate the bottom rung, and my son comes in at the bottom, and everybody's happy. What happens if they don't vacate? What happens if the 35-year-old holds on to the 25-year-old apartment, and 35-year-old's still stuck in the internship or the entry-level job, the apprentice job? What happens to the people who are coming in then? So the system could get jammed up if it doesn't keep flowing. Like the bathtub has the inflow and it has the outflow. What if the outflow is clogged and nobody can move forward? We have gridlock. Okay, well, that's the thesis I'm going to get to here. So here we go. I maintain in my article, Peak Millennials, that there's 3 reinforcing cycles that have coincided to create the current situation. And they were all harmonized to maximize urban presence, and now they're harmonizing to do the opposite, to unwind urban presence. You need to understand them, and they're very simple. The first one's the most simple of all, and some people think that's the whole idea. No, that's just the first step of 3. The first step is it has to do with the birth cycle 25 years earlier. And so, and its second step is about employment growth. Because, the Great Recession was kind of a big deal. The Great Recession really slammed the college generation that graduated in 2008. They walked right into a death trap of absolutely no economic opportunity. And so that has to have some role in the story. And then thirdly, there's a housing life cycle. People have to be able to move into housing, and they can't do that. They're going to stay with their parents back in the bedrooms in the suburbs. So we need to know about these 3 things and how they interplay. So on the birth cycle, here's the simplest data of all. I got really bright one day last August and said, I'm going to go look at the data on how many people were born each year. And we made a little graph, and there's the graph. This is the people born each year in America, native born. And we even highlighted, so you can't do the arithmetic, we highlighted the biggest cohort, 4.2 million people born in 1990. And by the way, how old were they in 2015? People born in 1990 are 25 years old. So that's the peak millennial cohort. And after that, it drops off. There's fewer. But what more important than the drop-off afterward is what happened before it. So before it, you actually had a 32% growth in the number of young people between those born in 1976 or 78 and those born in 1990. So in about a 12 to 14-year period, we had this upswing of 32% in the number of young people turning age 25. And so that upswing was from about 2000, or 2001, and 2015. And you had this huge surge of young people. Why? Were they preferring to live in the city, or were they just born 25 years earlier? Classic example of people being blind and naive to underlying demographics. They were born. There's more players, they're flooding the market, and people thought it might be preferences had changed when it's in the data right here. That's step one. And so now you have to think about it. If you're a 25-year-old, and I use that arbitrary age, you could say 22 or some other age, but 25 seems to be the heart of the millennial phenomena. And you're looking for your entry-level apartment. You're looking for, you're fighting to get a foothold. You're trying to find a vacancy that you can move into, entry-level job. Is there a job available that somebody else is not sitting on? And then you're facing this competition with your peers. Now, you're not competing with other 25-year-olds in my theory. You're competing with people who are a little bit older. The entire group of 25 to 29-year-olds. Because basically the theory is a 25-year-old moves into the slot currently occupied by somebody in their late 20s. The people in their late 20s are supposed to graduate from that slot and move on. If they don't graduate, the system's clogged up. The entry-level positions are being hogged by the incumbents who aren't moving on because they can't find another job, and the apartments are all tied up by the slightly older people who aren't moving on, and if people don't move on, nobody can move in. So the system's jammed up. That's the basic logic here. So we can look at some data, just a little bit here. Here's a graph. We're going to look at the employment cycle, the jobs, over the business cycle, and compare that to the rate of growth in the number of people in their 20s, the late 20s. And this graph does that here. First, we'll look at the growth of people in their late 20s. And what's interesting here is, during the 1990s, we were losing young people. They were shrinking. That's when Generation X, an undersized generation, was in their 20s. The number of young people was just plummeting. And then all of a sudden it turns around dramatically around 2001, and the number of young people starts skyrocketing. A total turnaround. Now, where would you rather be competing in the job and housing market? In the 1990s or in the 2000s? Just based on this graph, you think, well, there's going to be a lot of competition in the later 2000s compared to before. And you're right. But what makes it worse is when you compare it to the actual job growth. So here's the job growth that occurred in the 90s. During the Clinton administration, maybe by luck, I don't think presidents have that much control over the economy, but it gets all the credit or the blame, as Obama got the blame for the Great Recession. But the point being is there was lots of job growth in the 90s, and there weren't very many young people fighting for it. What a great time to be young. Generation X. And then we had this crossover period here in the Great Recession where you have this surging growth in young people and employment growth tanks. And that tanks for 4 years straight. I mean, you're zero. Zero growth averaged over 5 years' time. Zero. And surging numbers of young people. So what are you supposed to do? Well, you invent the sharing economy. You invent all kinds of ways of trying to hunker down and get by, but there's just not job growth. The projections are that job growth should now revive. It's not robust, as robust as before, but it's supposed to revive about 1% a year. It's not great, but it's going to be greater than the inflow of young people now because the peak millennials have passed, and we have smaller cohorts coming in to compete. So it looks like it'll be a much rosier time. So job growth has revived, and the competition has subsided. Well, we went through a very bleak period there, and I think that really had impacts on how people chose their location. They had to find roommates, friends they could double up with. They had to stay at home with their parents. They had to do all kinds of survival tactics. Now, the third cycle here is the housing life cycle. So I keep talking about moving to the city, getting a job, and finding a place to live. So the housing life cycle is a big part of getting a place to live. And obviously, there's a lot that could be said about this, and I'm going to keep it very brief, just one slide. I mean, just to show the overall life cycle. This is circa 2014. And the young people, the first thing they do, well, first off, the gray area at the top is people, it's everybody. It's all the population, and the light gray at the very top It's people who are still living with their parents or who are living with roommates or some other group quarters or something. And then the light green at the bottom is people who form rental apartment households, rental households of any kind. And that really peaks around age 30, and then it declines because they then transfer into homeowning. And so you see the darker green is rising steadily as a percentage of all people. More and more of them are homeowners. And then the shaded area, cross-hatched area above that, is this ambiguous group. These are the spouses or partners of renters or owners. And so they're not eligible to form separate households because they are living with their partners already. And in this method here, you don't want to double count the number of heads because there's one head per occupied unit. But they're not eligible. They are partners and spouses. And so there is a housing life cycle where you are living dependently with your parents or in a dorm, in a college or military or prison. Then you move into a rental unit, and then you move up to a homeowner unit. And that cycle is it's timeless. It happens at different speeds. But it's been very slowed down. I won't go into how much it's slowed down, but the Great Recession really cratered home ownership, as you likely know, and held back construction. I will show one construction slide. So how do you grow housing opportunity? There's only two ways to grow it. One is to build new units. The other way is to stimulate a greater turnover of existing units. So there's more vacancies being created by people turning over their apartments or their houses, selling their houses, and people can move into the existing stock. Both of those have shrunken during the recession. So here's the construction data assembled by Jung Ho Park. And you see this is for 1970. You see there's a boom-bust cycle that's been pretty regular. Then we had the long boom that occurred from the 90s all the way up to 2007. And then we had the deep crash. And now we're down here trying to recover. We're at much lower levels. We're definitely, percentage growth is really robust, but it's at a very low level. The bottom line is for apartments only, multifamily units. And that's recovering nicely, but it's still way lower than it used to be back in the good old days. So there's not a lot of new opportunity being generated from construction. It's improving. It's not as bad as it was. And so the millennials were backed up because nobody could find any new unit to move into. And if the older people don't go to the new units, then the millennials can't move into the recycled units. And so now that's all picking up speed. And it should accelerate greatly over the next 2 years based on permits that have already been put in place and new construction. We have this vacancy chain multiplier that is going to be occurring. But here in LA, we don't see that yet. We don't see this big revival of construction. It's happening, but it's not much. There's a political debate over it where people say there's unprecedented construction going on. And they say, well, yeah, compared to the Great Recession, thank God. I mean, unprecedented compared to that. What, do you want to live in a Great Recession forever? So we have to get back to something that will accommodate the actual people who live here. So if you have a housing shortage, what happens? And this is a new project we're working on. We're trying to get it going better. But I wanted to give you some highlights of this. This comes out of a study we did for the Mortgage Bankers Association. They're very concerned about the housing market. This comes out of a national study, and we just recently have started to convert it to LA County. So I'm going to give you some initial LA County findings. Jung Ho Park was instrumental in doing this piece of research. What happens in a housing shortage? Well, the would-be home buyers become renters. Simple thing to say, but we're going to trace out what does that mean, really, they become renters. The millennials keep arriving, meanwhile. You can't stop them. They get older 1 year at a time. They graduate college on schedule, and they come piling into the city, and they then join the diverted homeowners, and they sandwich the existing renters and squeeze the heck out of them. And those who can't pay get ejected. Now, meanwhile, developers are trying to slowly build new supply. I said it wrong. They're not trying to build it slowly, but it's being built slowly despite their best efforts. And meanwhile, we have these desperate home seekers, and here's my poetic terminology. I have to quote myself. Desperate home seekers scavenge and overpay, double up, or disappear. Those are all bad things. What does it mean to scavenge? That's what happens when rich people end up living in really housing that was built for the middle class. That's all they can find. And that's what happens when middle class people end up living in working class housing. That's all they can find. Everybody is scavenging whatever there is, and it leads to gentrification and other consequences because there's not enough housing. So here's the data by our calculations. Our calculations are that between 2006, which is like the sort of the peak of the housing boom, and 2014 in LA County, there are, I skipped a page. There are 314,000 diverted homeowners. These are people who actually live in LA, but the people haven't gone away. The people are still there, and by our calculations, they would have been homeowners, but they're not. So instead of not being homeowners, they're being renters. And so there's 314,000 diverted homeowners thrown into the rental stock. And they're joining 212,000 expected growth in renters coming from the millennials and others. That combines to about 500,000 increase in renters. But we didn't add that much housing. We only added, it's hard to tell exactly how much. The next slide shows that, because some of it's unmeasurable. We have 82,000 building permits. But that's not all of the stock. There seems to be 177,000 additional renters that are counted. And so instead of 526, 500,000, we have 177,000, which we estimate is 353,000 people were displaced from the housing market but still live in LA County. There's additional people who gave up on LA completely and moved out of town. But those aren't in the population data anymore. They're gone. So these are only people who live here but aren't living in the kind of housing you would have expected. Expected is not based on 2006, not at the height of the bubble. We're using 2000 as our normal definition of what percent should be household heads, what percent should be renters, what percent do we expect to be owners. That's all pre-bubble. It's back in the last years of normalcy. And so we have 353,000 that we think have gone away. Now, where do they go to? They're doubled up. Well, we don't. They're in LA County, living somewhere. They're on the street, but they're not in apartments, not heading apartments. So the net result here for millennials is that everything's slowed down, backed up, and into the parents' homes or bottled up in singles areas. That's what's happened. But the millennials over age 25 or over age 30 are really breaking out, trying to find better housing, especially once they have kids. They're pushing to find more room, and wherever they can find it, and that includes gentrifying housing close to singles districts and moving gradually outward. But it seems like they do have an urban preference that says, no, we don't want to move way out to the outer suburbs. We'd rather live close-in suburbs. So I hear that Culver City is called a suburb in Los Angeles. That's a close-in suburb. So is Pasadena, and so is everywhere else, Long Beach, all around. Okay, so conclusion. Is this a new era for millennials? The millennials have gotten older, but the economic conditions have changed. There's more jobs. Housing is struggling to recover still. But they're getting older, and they're pushing into a new life stage. And so this is my conclusion. They're freed from the housing gridlock, and it looks like they're going to be exercising their true preferences, whatever they are. We'll see now what those preferences really are. And I'll just let you read that. I won't repeat what I've said. But the three cycles are now harmonized to work to unwind the urban preference, or the urban presence, the urban concentration that was there before. It's being unwound. There's fewer young people coming in than there are older people who are moving out. The bathtub is starting to flow again, we think. So these ideas are referenced in these two articles. You want to read more about them, and I thank you very much. So Is there still time for questions? Okay. Time for a couple questions. I can't see. Okay, here we go.
Hi. Just curious. My perception of how millennials are not marrying.
Not yet.
Yeah. And a lot of the multiple family housing that's 4 or 5 stories, typical around downtown and a little further out, and with some maybe commercial on the first floor, something like this, modern design, the whole bit. What I've noticed, just generally speaking, that new housing, because I don't see huge tracts of single-family homes being built anywhere, is that those multifamily dwellings tend to be mostly, from what I can tell, studio, 1 bedroom, not too many 2 or 3 bedroom, and rarely 4. These don't seem very, I don't know, conducive to family living if you go by the suburban model of a single family home. I don't know.
Okay. I hear your question, and I can answer that. And that's how it is. That's how it's always been. It's at least since 1950. When they build apartments in America, they build them with most 2 bedrooms. And I always wondered about that because they end up being the home of some low-income family that has kids, but it's built new, not for low income, it's built new for middle class. And if you're middle class and you have kids, you're not looking to move into a new apartment, you're looking to move into a house. And so the market for developers, I wrote this once, I called it the tyranny of the minority. And get this, the minority is the 1%. No, not that 1%. It's the 1% who actually moves into a new unit in a given year. In California, only 1% moves into a new unit. That's the constituency for developers. They don't care about people who, like me, who live in hand-me-downs. They want to know who's looking for a new, and that's their market. And the people who are looking for new have to be able to pay for new. And so when you build apartments, you're building them for singles or for couples who don't have kids, or maybe just have a baby. And so they're building them small for the middle class. And then later it trickles down to the larger families. And I've not yet figured out a strategy for how can you possibly get an incentive to build 3-bedroom apartments knowing that 20 years from now it'll be needed by a larger family. I don't know how to do that. Anybody has any ideas? That would be great. That would be great to know the secret answer to that. But it's just built into the system. Only the middle class can pay for new construction by and large, and that's going to be singles or couples who go for apartments. And it's a limitation. It's a serious problem. It's been that way since 1950.
Hi. I have 2 questions. I don't know if that's cheating or not, but one is, if this is a presence, not a preference, can we expect some negative environmental consequences as such a large group exits the urban core towards other housing opportunities?
Not necessarily. As long as they're replacing they're moving into existing housing, they're not increasing their footprint. But we want to know, where do the previous occupants move to? So if they move into baby boomers' houses, and the baby boomers then want to live downtown in a townhouse or a condo, then we're golden. Mm-hmm. That would work out. So not necessarily is it environmentally negative.
Okay. And then my second question is, especially for the 25-year-old millennials that you were talking about, it seems that they've had a lot of delayed economic opportunity in the past few years, which would also prevent them from the typical savings period that would lead up before the homeownership phase. Do you see that that's going to delay this outflow also?
Yeah. I've been working on a study for Fannie Mae on the role of parents in helping people buy houses. Because between student loans and delayed opportunity, the young people aren't able to save a lot. But in my theory here, I'm not actually saying the millennials move into the new home. I'm saying that there's some other person who's 35 years old who's not able to move into a new home. If they can move into a new home, then they can turn over their apartment, and the millennials can move into that one. So the whole chain has been backed up. So the problem probably is not at age 25. The problem is actually probably at 35. But the millennials, the Gen X who's age 35, they got slammed by the recession too. So we got big problems, and there's big questions of what's the role in government in trying to stimulate this chain. And no one seems to quite recognize that there's any kind of connections between the different movers. They view it as separate consumers. Yeah, Randall.
Dowell, great presentation. The room is loaded with policymakers, elected planning directors. What advice do you have them to try to deal with the housing crisis for the millennials?
Well, I know there's no magic wand anybody can wave. And there's lots of everybody is constrained by the local voters. Local voters will throw anybody out of office who gets out of line. And so you have to convince the local voters. Voters don't understand what the housing crisis means. They don't understand. They all have their own house. And so they don't, and they know what their kids' situation is, but they don't really feel it. So they don't understand how it connects to everybody. And we'll talk about that more this morning, I think, in other panels. So I think you have to build the public will to understand what's normal and why we need to have a normal amount of housing and what the consequences are of not doing that. So it's a broad education process. We're engaged in it right now, I think, in this city. And there was another question I thought back there earlier.
Hi. So I am that quintessential 25-year-old millennial that you are talking about, and I think this was a very spot-on presentation, but I think there's two key things that aren't necessarily missing, but maybe just weren't pointed out. One is the cost of student loans, and that dramatically kind of takes out of your net monthly paycheck that you're getting from these entry-level jobs. The second is that all of the new housing that I've seen or that I know is being built is really geared toward that luxury owner. I work in downtown, so all of the buildings that I've seen come around are $3,000 for a one-bedroom place in a luxury building with all these great amenities. But so it's hard as someone who has these loans and is in an entry-level position to A, try to save after paying off your loans and paying your rent, but B, trying to find these places that are livable because everything new that's coming on board is way out of my price range. So I think that that's another really important thing to look at is what these student loans are doing, and then also the type of housing that's around. It's in LA, it's like a regional downtown issue, I think, but it is something really important to pay attention to.
Well, so you're saying it's not affordable what's being built for millennials?
Exactly.
Well, the land costs are a major handicap for developers. It may be that those aren't really going to be suitable for most millennials.
Yeah.
The point is, if you don't provide housing for rich people, where do they live? They go and scavenge.
Yeah, well, I'm just
they make it worse.
In terms of the the preferences of millennials to live in cities, that's going to get harder and harder to do when, particularly, I'm using downtown as an example, but
well,
the housing here is really expensive, so you're going to see that migration of people going into Northeast Los Angeles, Pasadena, all those places away from the downtown because it's just becoming unaffordable.
Right. So the price of housing will force people to go outward, but they're on a leash now. Their leash is tighter than it was previously when they could have driven to, Santa Clarita.
Yeah.
So it's a shorter leash, but still they're pushing outward to find something affordable, and they're going into neighborhoods and gentrifying. Yeah. Like Boyle Heights is really close to downtown.
Echo Park.
It's true in every city. In Austin, Texas, you see what's going on there, that the black area is almost eliminated now. The black neighborhood traditionally is too close to downtown. So it's a serious, and driven by millennials. It's a serious problem across the country, and it takes time to build houses, and we have a deep deficit, and it has all these consequences we can't erase. It's going to take 20 years to get back to normal. I hate to say it. 10 years would be great, but it's going to take a while.
Hi, have we taken a look, this is Michelle Martinez, have we taken a look at how millennials and even Generation Xers, which I am, I'm 36, I'll be 37 in August.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
On
I'm
being
getting
so young.
old. I'm no longer, I wish I were a millennial, not right, but because I feel bad for the millennials. They're the most educated population, and unfortunately they don't have the same opportunities that I had or that many of us in this room had. So they're at a disadvantage. My question to you is that the housing imbalance as it pertains to employment, I think many folks today don't want to be tied down, and it's probably another reason why they don't want to buy a house is because of the imbalance of work and housing. Many people don't want to commute, and specifically the younger generation like millennials. So do we see millennials continuing to rent, or will they purchase homes based on employment? If that makes sense.
It's a big question. I mean, lots of people are trying to figure that out. The surveys all show they say they want to own. But do they want to own right away? They even say the next time I move, I expect to own. But it's not going to happen.
Well, many of their jobs, for example, many people will work in Orange County, live in Los Angeles, or live in the Inland Empire, work in Orange County, and that commute is just brutal. And so what I've experienced in, living in the city of Santa Ana, for a one-bedroom apartment, and I tell you that I rent, it's almost $1,800, right, to live in the downtown for 750 square feet. And so I'm starting to see that, as you mentioned, I live alone, but many of the folks that live in my apartment complex are fairly young, but there's 2 or 3, 4 of them living in a one-bedroom, 2-bedroom apartment because they can't afford it, but their jobs are in Orange County, so they're willing to bundle up to stay near their employment.
Yeah. It's a new European lifestyle where we live outside the home. We live in cafes on the street as opposed to our living room. We live on the internet. It's really, things are shifting. Well, yeah, we're going to be addressing a lot of these topics. A lot of these questions are going to be addressed in panels to come this morning. So, I hope this just primes the pump. I just wanted to give you the idea of the flow and how it's turning, but there's obstacles in really getting that flow to really work again the way it's supposed to work. But there's all kinds of frictions along the way. The local citizens are aware of the frictions, and that's what we have to be able to address as well as elected officials or planners. So let's turn to the program here is to call up the next panel now. Panel 1.